Caleb Rourke checked the scale 3 times before he looked at Mara Bennett. The first time, he leaned forward like the sun was washing out the numbers. The second time, he tapped the metal housing with the side of his pen. The third time, he stepped off the platform, walked around behind it, and looked at the power cable. Nothing changed. The digital display still read 114 pounds. The lamb standing on the scale was one of 36 Katahdin-Dorper crosses Mara had brought to the sale barn outside West Plains, Missouri, that Thursday morning. He was thick through the shoulders, clean underneath, and calm enough to chew while 3 grown men stared at him like he had just performed a card trick. Caleb flipped through the weight sheets again. 114 average? He asked. 112.8, Mara said. After the light one. He looked past her at the rest of the lambs in the holding pen. They were nearly the same size, nearly the same condition, and a whole lot better than they had any business being after the summer southern Missouri had just survived. By August, most of Howell County had turned the color of old cardboard. The ponds were low. Hay prices were climbing. Neighbors who had spent their whole lives raising livestock were selling animals they had planned to keep. And somehow, Mara's lambs had kept gaining. Caleb knew what commercial feed cost. He also knew she had bought less than half the grain most people expected for a flock her size. He set his clipboard on the top rail. "All right, Mara," he said. "What are you feeding them?" She almost laughed, because that was the same question she had asked 10 months earlier. She looked toward the parking lot, where her old red pickup sat with dried mud up the doors and a chicken feather caught under one windshield wiper. Then she thought about the gray tool shed back home, the one with the sagging roof, the mouse-chewed feed sacks, and the blue notebook she had found behind a coffee can full of bent nails. The answer Caleb wanted was not a feed recipe. It was 6 days, and it had taken Mara most of a year to understand that. The farm had belonged to her grandmother, Evelyn Bennett, before it belonged to her. 68 acres in the Missouri Ozarks did not sound small until someone tried to make a living from it. The ground rolled. The soil changed every 50 feet. One slope grew good orchard grass. The next grew blackberry canes, sumac, wild rose, and cedar seedlings sharp enough to punch through a work glove. The bottom field stayed wet too long in spring. The south ridge dried out too fast in summer. There was one pond that held water, one pond that pretended to, and a creek that disappeared the minute anyone counted on it. When Evelyn died, Mara inherited 42 ewes, 3 boar-cross goats, a mixed flock of laying hens, 2 feeder pigs, a tractor older than her mother, and a stack of bills that had somehow survived longer than everything else. Mara was 27 years old. She had worked at a veterinary clinic in Springfield, but answering phones and holding nervous Labradors had not made her a livestock expert. She knew enough to recognize when an animal was sick. She did not know enough to make 68 rough acres pay for themselves. By the end of her first summer, the sheep had grazed their favorite plants down to the dirt. The goats had turned into professional escape artists. The chickens spent half their time scratching around the barn because Mara had no reliable way to move them. The pigs were gaining, but every bag of feed she carried into their pen felt like another $20 bill disappearing into mud. Worst of all, the lambs were growing slowly, not dying, not visibly failing, just growing slowly enough to destroy the math. Slow growth was quiet. It did not kick down a gate or call at midnight. It just added days. More days on feed. More days using pasture. More days before Mara got paid. She started waking up at 3 in the morning doing arithmetic. How many ewes could she sell and still have a flock? How much hay would she need if winter came early? Would the bank extend the operating note? Would she be better off selling everything while she still had something worth selling? One afternoon in late September, her neighbor, Hank Mercer, pulled into the driveway. Hank had raised cattle on the adjoining place for 35 years. He was not a mean man, but he had a way of giving advice that sounded like a verdict. He stood at the fence, watched Mara's sheep nose through a patch they had already grazed twice, and said, "You need fewer mouths. I know. You can't graze hope. I know. Your grandma could make this place work because she knew every inch of it." That one landed harder than the others. Hank must have seen it on her face, because he looked away toward the ridge. "I'm not saying you can't learn," he said, but that was exactly what he was saying. After he left, Mara walked into the tool shed looking for a spool of electric fence wire. The shed had not been cleaned out since before Evelyn got sick. There were mineral tubs stacked in one corner, old hand tools on the wall, and shelves filled with coffee cans labeled in her blocky handwriting. Fence staples, cotter pins, gate hinges, things worth keeping. The notebook was behind the can of bent nails. It had been blue once, but the cover had faded to the color of a cloudy sky. A rubber band held it shut. When Mara touched the band, it snapped and dropped to the floor in two dry pieces. She expected household accounts or breeding dates. Instead, the first page showed a map, not a professional survey. Just the farm drawn in pencil, divided into small numbered sections. Some were shaped like rectangles. Others followed the slopes and tree lines. Beside each one, Evelyn had written dates, rainfall, grass height, and short notes. Sheep entered. Goats followed. Hens after 6. Rest 32 days. Too wet. Wait. Move sooner. Mara sat down on an upside-down bucket. The next pages covered years. Different flock sizes. Different weather. Different field arrangements. Notes about which plants the sheep ate first and which brush the goats would strip after them. Then, near the middle of the notebook, Mara found a page with 4 lines boxed in red pencil. Day 1. Sheep into the paddock. Day 3. Goats for brush. Day 6. Move the chicken house. Usable scraps to pigs. Spoiled feed and bedding to compost. She read it again. Day 1. Day 3. Day 6. It seemed almost too simple. Mara had been treating the farm like 4 separate problems. The sheep needed pasture. The goats needed containment. The chickens needed fresh ground. The pigs needed cheaper feed. Evelyn had not treated them as separate problems. She had treated them as a sequence. The sheep went first because they were the business. They took the best grass and broadleaf forage while it was clean and tall. The goats followed because they preferred brush, vines, leaves, and woody growth the sheep left behind. Then the chickens came through in a mobile house, scratching apart manure, picking through insects and spilled material, and adding their own fertility. Anything edible and safe left from garden sorting or produce pickups could go to the pigs. Anything moldy, spoiled, or unsuitable for livestock went to the compost pile with bedding and manure. Each group entered after the one before it had changed the ground. Mara carried the notebook to the kitchen and read until midnight. The next morning, she called a produce packing shed near Mountain Grove. A woman named Dana Ruiz answered. Mara told her she had 2 pigs and a compost pile. She asked whether the shed had unsold squash, bruised apples, wilted greens, or other produce it was paying to haul away. Dana was quiet for a second. "How big is your truck?" "Depends how generous you're feeling." Dana laughed. That was how it started. The first load was mostly damaged pumpkins, cabbage leaves, and apples too bruised for grocery stores. Dana made Mara sign a form saying she understood the produce was not processed livestock feed and that she was responsible for sorting it. Mara sorted every load. Clean, usable produce went to the pigs in controlled amounts alongside their balanced ration. Rotten or moldy material went straight to compost. Plastic bands, stickers, mesh bags, and anything questionable went into the trash. The pigs did not eliminate her feed bill. That was never the point. They turned a usable byproduct into weight, manure, and eventually pork, while the compost pile caught what could not be fed safely. But the pigs were the easy part. The rotation was where everything started going wrong. Mara bought used electric netting from a man in Ava who swore it had only been used for 2 seasons. That may have been true, but he did not mention that half the posts were bent and several wires had been patched with fishing line. She divided the north pasture into 6 small paddocks. The notebook said the sheep went in first, so Mara moved 42 ewes and 38 lambs into the first section on a Monday morning. For the first hour, it looked perfect. The sheep spread out through knee-high grass. The lambs buried their faces in clover. Mara stood by the gate with her coffee and felt, for the first time in months, like she might know what she was doing. At 10:17, an ewe named Dot put her head through the netting, panicked, dragged 15 feet of fence sideways, and released the entire flock onto the driveway. The sheep ran toward the garden. Mara ran after the sheep. The goats saw the sheep running and decided they had been invited. By noon, Mara had livestock in 3 places, a torn fence, 1 flattened tomato row, and coffee in her boot. Evelyn's notebook had not mentioned that part. Mara fixed the fence and tried again. On day 3, she moved the sheep forward and brought the goats into the first paddock. The goats ate blackberry leaves for approximately 11 minutes. Then one of them, a brown doe named Mabel, climbed onto a fallen log, jumped the netting, and walked directly to the feed room. The other 2 followed. Mara found them standing outside the closed door, waiting for her to stop pretending they were interested in ecological restoration. By day 6, she was determined to get 1 complete rotation right. The mobile chicken house was a low wooden structure Evelyn had built on an old hay wagon frame. It held 58 hens and had wheels that looked sturdy until someone asked them to move. Mara hitched it to the tractor. It rolled 20 yards. Then the left wheel sank into a soft patch left by a leaking water line. The tractor dug down. The chicken house leaned. The hens shifted to one side, which made it lean farther. Mara spent the next 2 hours with a shovel, 2 fence posts, a bottle jack, and language Evelyn would not have written in the notebook. By the time she got the house onto the paddock, it was almost dark. She stood there watching the chickens step onto fresh ground, scratching through the surface and chasing grasshoppers. For maybe 5 minutes, the whole system made sense. Then it started raining. It rained for 2 days. The clay soil softened. The chicken house wheels sank again. The pigs turned the area near their water tank into soup. The goats refused to leave their shelter. And because Mara was determined to follow Evelyn's schedule exactly, she moved animals when the notebook said to move them, whether the ground was ready or not. That was her first real mistake. Her second was worse. In October, there was an unexpected stretch of warm weather. The pasture looked better than it had in August, and Mara convinced herself the grass could handle more pressure. She left the sheep in 1 paddock an extra day. They had already eaten the best forage. On that extra day, they went back over the same ground and grazed the new bites lower. Mara told herself she was getting full use from the paddock. What she was actually doing was taking the plant's recovery energy. 2 weeks later, that paddock still looked weak. A month later, several lambs showed higher parasite counts than the others. Dr. Leah Porter, the large animal veterinarian out of Kabul, looked over Mara's records and asked how tightly she had been rotating. 3 days, Mara said. Always? That's what the schedule says. What does the grass say? Mara did not have an answer. Leah looked at her for a moment. Schedules are useful, she said. Animals and plants don't own calendars. That night, Mara nearly threw Evelyn's notebook away. She set it on the kitchen table and stared at the red box. Day 1, Day 3, Day 6. It looked ridiculous. 6 days had become another thing Mara was failing at. The sheep had broken the fence. The goats kept escaping. The chickens were stuck in mud. The pigs were costing more time than she expected. One paddock was damaged. The lambs were still behind her target weights. Hank had been right. She could not graze hope. Mara opened the notebook one more time, mostly because she wanted evidence that the system had been a bad idea from the beginning. That was when she noticed the writing in the margins. The main entries were dark and neat. The margin notes were lighter, smaller, and easy to miss. Day 3. If brush is dry. Delay hens after heavy rain. Move sheep early when lower leaves are taken. Do not force the 3rd day. Rest longer in July. Shorten exposure after warm rain. Mara turned the page. There were crossed out dates. Arrows. Replacement numbers. Notes about a goat getting tangled in fence. A chicken wagon wheel breaking after a storm. A group of lambs that had been left too long in one section. One entry said, followed the dates instead of the field. Paid for it. Mara read that line 4 times. Evelyn had made the same mistake. The 6-day rotation was not a commandment. It was a starting pattern. Day 1 meant the sheep received first access. Day 3 meant the goats followed while the brush was still attractive and before regrowth became vulnerable. Day 6 meant the chickens came after the ground had settled enough to carry the mobile house. The sequence mattered. The exact day could change. Evelyn had not left Mara a perfect system. She had left her a record of an imperfect person paying attention. That changed everything. Mara stopped measuring success by whether she followed the calendar. She started measuring the farm. Before moving the sheep, she checked forage height. After moving them, she looked at what remained. She watched whether they were still taking full bites from the upper parts of the plants or reaching down for shorter regrowth. The goats followed when the leaves were dry and the brush was worth browsing. If a paddock had little woody growth, they stayed for less time. If the soil was too soft, the chickens waited. Sometimes they arrived on day 6. Sometimes day 8. Once, after a hard rain, they did not enter until day 11. Mara moved their house more frequently once it was in place, so manure did not build up under the roosting area. She added a gravel pad around the pigs' water. She limited wet produce and mixed in drier feed. She built the compost pile in layers, spoiled plant material, used bedding, manure, and dry carbon from old hay and leaves. She kept 2 notebooks. Evelyn stayed in the house. Mara's traveled in the truck. She wrote down the date each group entered and left. She recorded rainfall, forage height, condition scores, lamb weights, egg counts, feed purchases, and every failure she would have preferred to forget. Mabel escaped 4 more times. Dot broke the fence twice. The chicken wagon lost another wheel in February. One compost pile went cold because Mara made it too dry. A batch of produce arrived, so spoiled that none of it could be used for the pigs. She wrote all of it down. By spring, the changes were small but visible. The first thing Mara noticed was not the sheep. It was the blackberry patch on the east slope. The goats had opened narrow paths through it. Sunlight reached the ground. Grass and clover were growing between stems that had once formed a solid wall. The next thing she noticed was the chicken paddocks. Where the hens had followed under good conditions, manure pats were broken apart faster. The ground carried a more even layer of plant residue. Mara could walk through without seeing the same heavy concentrations around shade and water. The pigs produced manure and disturbed their own designated area, but they were no longer standing in knee-deep mud. The compost pile began heating properly. Months later, Mara spread the finished material on a thin section near the tool shed where grass had always struggled. Then the lambs began to change. They were not getting fat. They were getting steady. That mattered more. Instead of some lambs racing ahead while others fell behind, the group became more uniform. The sheep were moving on to cleaner forage more often. They were not staying long enough to graze each paddock into the ground. The recovery periods lengthened as summer approached. Mara still bought minerals. She still bought hay. She still used grain strategically. No notebook turned the farm into a place where outside inputs became unnecessary. But she bought less emergency feed. The pasture stayed productive longer. The lambs reached market condition with fewer extra days. And the farm began acting less like four unrelated mouths and more like one connected system. The sheep drove the business. The goats reclaimed forage the sheep could use later. The chickens followed and distributed fertility. The pigs captured value from safe surplus food. The compost returned what could not be fed. Nothing was perfectly closed. No real farm was. But fewer things ended as waste. In early August, Caleb Rourke called. He bought lambs for several processors and private buyers across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas. The year before, he had told Mara her group was too uneven. "You still running sheep?" he asked. "That depends. Are you still buying them? I heard yours are looking different." "From who?" "People talk." People did talk. They especially talked when they did not understand something. A week later, Caleb came to the farm. Mara did not mow the driveway. She did not hide the broken gate leaning against the barn. She did not move the chicken house to make the place look cleaner. When he arrived, the sheep were in a paddock below the ridge. The goats were 2 sections behind them, working along a brush line. The chicken house sat farther back on ground dry enough to support it. The pigs were asleep in the shade beside their pen. Caleb stood at the fence and watched the lambs. He did not say much. He walked through the group, put his hands on several backs, checked their finish, and looked at their feet. Then he asked to see Mara's records. At the kitchen table, he compared the lamb weights to the feed receipts. He ran the numbers twice. "This doesn't match," he said. "It does. You didn't buy enough feed." "I bought what's on the receipts." He looked toward the window. "What's the trick?" "There isn't one. There's always something." Mara thought about showing him Evelyn's notebook then, but she did not. Not yet. She wanted the scale to answer first. That was how she ended up at the sale barn on a Thursday morning with 36 lambs, Caleb's clipboard on the rail, and 112.8 pounds written at the bottom of the sheet. He looked at the lamb on the scale, then at the rest of the group, then at Mara. "What are you feeding them?" he asked again. She shook her head. "You're still asking the wrong question." He frowned. "What should I be asking?" "What happens before they get fed?" He followed her back to the farm that afternoon. They walked to the tool shed. Mara moved the coffee can of bent nails and took Evelyn's blue notebook from the shelf. The cover was softer now. The pages smelled like dust, pencil lead, and the old cedar chest where Mara stored it during wet weather. She opened to the red box. Day 1, sheep into the paddock. Day 3, goats for brush. Day 6, move the chicken house. Usable scraps to pigs. Spoiled feed and bedding to compost. Caleb read it. That's it? That's where it starts. He turned the page and saw the corrections. The weather notes. The failed moves. The broken wheel. The parasite warnings. The sentence Evelyn had written years earlier. Followed the dates instead of the field. Paid for it. Then Mara put her notebook beside her grandmother's. Her handwriting was messier. Her pages had coffee stains, feed calculations, egg counts, lamb weights, and enough crossed-out dates to prove she had learned slowly. On the last open page, she wrote the sale weight. 36 lambs. Average, 112.8 pounds. She put the date beside it. Caleb watched her close the notebook. "So the 6-day plan worked," he said. "No," Mara told him. Paying attention worked. The schedule had given her an order. The farm had told her the timing. That was the difference. Mara used to think Evelyn had known something she did not. Some perfect method. Some secret that made the land easier for her than it was for Mara. But that notebook proved the opposite. The land had not been easier. Evelyn had broken fences. She had moved animals at the wrong time. She had lost grass, repaired wheels, changed plans, and written down mistakes she probably hoped nobody would ever need to repeat. What she passed down was not certainty. It was permission to adjust. Sometimes a farm does not need more land. Sometimes it does not need a miracle feed or a brand new machine. Sometimes it needs the right order. One animal takes what it needs. The next animal uses what remains. The waste from one part becomes an input somewhere else. And when the weather changes, the plan changes with it. So when someone has been told they are too young, too inexperienced, or too small to make something work, the answer is not to spend a lifetime pretending they never make mistakes. The answer may be to find the people who wrote theirs down, to open the drawer nobody has opened in 30 years, to read the notes in the margins. That may be where they left the part that matters. And as for what happened when Mabel the goat disappeared during a thunderstorm and came back with something tied around her neck that changed the farm again, that story began at the county fair, with an empty livestock trailer and a man Mara had never seen before.